Today, I am excited to show you something quite a bit different. For this painting, I am painting a subject that you don't often see me paint on this channel. I am working off of a landscape, and not just any old landscape. I am working off of a painting that someone who I feel really grateful to call my friend, Kyle Ma, gave me to paint off of. This is a reference that he took, and he and I actually sat down and virtually painted together. He painted his version and I painted mine. And so for today's video, I want to share with you a conversation that he and I had after I completed this painting, where he and I talked about what we saw as being the differences between his painting as a very experienced and successful landscape painter and what I was able to produce. I think this conversation is going to be really helpful because it really has a lot to share in terms of the process of achieving mastery and how it isn't as simple as saying, well, I've been painting for this long, or I, paint portraits to this level, so of course I should be able to paint everything at this level. And that's simply not the case. There's all kinds of nuances that you learn when you fall in love with a particular subject. So I was really, really grateful to be able to sit down with Kyle today and talk about what some of those nuances are from his perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive into this conversation with Kyle Ma while you watch this painting unfold. First and foremost, thank you for letting me work off of your reference and for giving me something to paint that day. That was really what I needed. I've noticed that it's really easy to get into a place where, especially I think when you kind of know what your style is, or you know what you're kind of known for painting, it's a little easy to feel like it's getting repetitive. You always have such great references to work off of. How do you like to think about dividing your time to get a reference like this one? Do you have periods throughout the year where you know that you want to plan trips and your focus is more on gathering reference versus painting? And do you have a sense of how much studio time throughout the year taking those references is going to get you through?
Not really. I don't think about it that much. I'm fortunate to be able to travel either just for myself or to teach workshops or go to other art events. And so whenever I get a chance, bring my camera along and get as many references as I can. And when I get home, I can just go through them, pick out the ones that I like, and try and develop those ideas further.
And you're really prolific too. So I know that on those trips, you must be getting a lot, but I think on top of that, you have a really good system that works for you as far as making sure that you have your camera, or you know how to get a good reference when you happen to be in the right moment. Do you feel like that's true? Is there a certain percentage of the time where you just happen to have the tool that you need and you weren't necessarily expecting to get a reference, but you did get something that was really helpful to paint from?
Yeah, there's both. I do sometimes like to go on Google Earth and figure out the topography and try and take a guess at where the light's going to be at what point, and check the weather forecast. But a lot of times when you're out in nature, things don't always go according to plan, and so it's good to just drive around or walk around and explore the area and be open-minded for what kind of possibilities there are. And I like the mentality, if there's something that, even if there's just a small chance that might be useful, just go ahead and take that photo, bring it back home. And sometimes when I sort through them at first, a particular reference I don't think much of it until later. I might play around with it on Procreate or do little color studies, and then I come up with some kind of idea, or vice versa. There could be a reference that I'm super excited to use initially, and I just never end up getting to it. But my mindset is, when we're painting, we're not necessarily always just trying to create masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece. But my mentality is, if I have an idea, just go ahead and get it down on canvas or on paper. Just do something with it and to work it out physically, not just try and do everything in my head. And so I like to think of, I do these studies, and these studies are going to help with creating some bigger, possibly gallery ready pieces, which might be able to inform those large pieces, those large ambitious pieces that I might want to be known for. So it's all a process. It's not about getting everything perfect in that little study.
Yeah. It seems like there's kind of this like funnel, right? Where like you start by going out and really maximizing your opportunities to get great reference. And I imagine only a fraction of those are good enough to turn into paintings. And then from there, you might go and you might test it out with studies, little compositions, playing around in Procreate. You then like whittle the references down even further in terms of like, oh, now that I've tested this out, I don't think this is really a good fit. And it might just kind of stay a study and you might move on to the next reference. And then as you kind of progress through until you get to those masterpieces, those like gallery ready pieces, it winds up being a really, really small percentage of the images that you had initially set yourself up to capture or hoped you might be able to paint from.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Out of curiosity, and it's okay if you don't have an answer to this question, but like if you had to guess what percentage of references that you capture for paintings actually wind up making it to a painting that you would consider gallery ready? Is it like 50%? Is it 1%? Like what kind of ballpark are we talking about?
Oh, that's interesting because I have saved a lot of references that I feel like have potential, but I'm just waiting for to work everything out in my head, and then maybe one day I'll make a painting out of it. Maybe I won't, and a lot of it depends on my experience when I'm on location, because it's not just trying to this thing where take reference, paint. It's all about trying to get a full experience when I'm at that location and understand the landscape. And these references are being used as a starting point along with the sketches that I do. Yeah, it's tough to put a number on it.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially because, there are references that you still might use. And on top of that, if you're anything like me, I've had photo shoots where I've come home with 3,000 photos and I use maybe 20 of them. And it's really hard to like even hold that kind of math in your head when you're thinking about the number of rejects you might get from something like that. So, like, how often do you really get to like sketch or paint in person? And what are some of the other things you might use to really make sure you're like maximizing your own understanding of the landscape before you head home?
Yeah, so painting is one of the best ways, painting on location, because it really does force you to look closer. But also, I like to hike around and sometimes even talk to locals, just to get a sense of what that place is like and have that emotional connection to the place.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I think that really comes through in a lot of your paintings. And I think it's really helpful to think about, like, especially in the process of creating a piece of art, it's not all about the logistics of like getting your reference in front of you, taking a look at it and copying it. There's so much that has to do with like what emotions you bring to that piece and what little nuances of the geography you really want to pull out. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about before we talk about these paintings that we just made. You had mentioned earlier that there's just so many things you can't predict on the day. You can do the research ahead of time. You can look at Google Earth. You can take into account the time of year and the time of day you're going to be there. and what the weather is supposed to be like. But for instance, like when you got the reference for that gorgeous, huge, beautiful Grand Canyon piece, the like 30 by 40 piece, I would really love to hear what it was like getting that reference. And did you have the weather and lighting conditions you expected to have for getting that reference, or were there little surprises that wound up creeping up on you?
I love that you asked about that one because I have a very interesting story to tell. It probably took me 4 or 5 tries to get that reference. I was spending the day at the Grand Canyon, and in the morning, I hiked along the rim, and I found this place called Powell Point, and I found those rock formations, and it looked amazing. But I thought, you know what? It would look even better in the afternoon or evening. So I decided to go back to where I was staying and come back later. But then it started raining and snowing, and so I kept trying to go back at various times, hoping for a break in the rain and that streak of light to come through. And I think it was the fourth try in the evening that I saw the rain was starting to die down, and so I made a bet that it's gonna clear up once I get to that point. So I hopped on the bus and went over there for the fourth time, and sure enough, the clouds started to leave and the light started to come in, and I saw that and I knew that it was gonna be a good one.
That's incredible. And how long was that lighting in the condition you wanted it before it changed and you had a totally different image?
So I had probably 20 or 30 minutes. So I didn't do any on location sketches, but I just took a bunch of different photos and with slightly different angles and slightly different foreground elements that I can come back home and play with.
Did you wind up playing with the clouds at all? You have like really beautiful cloud formations in that piece, and I'm wondering if that's what you had exactly on that day, or if that was kind of an amalgamation of like different moments for getting that reference, or even, clouds that might have been from a slightly different vantage point if you were getting like other reference while you were out there.
Yeah, it was pretty similar. I moved some things around for the sake of design, but it was pretty much what it generally looked like at that moment.
Yeah.
Play around with the design of, because there are clouds and those clouds would cast certain shadows on the canyon, and so I just strategically placed those shadows where I wanted to make the design work better.
Tell me a little bit about the reference that you got for the painting that that we both just took a crack at. Where was this? When did you get this reference? And was there anything particularly unusual about this particular location, or was it like a pretty standard, photo shoot?
So this was in Jackson, Wyoming. I traveled there last year for a show, and it was a rainy morning, and there's this place called the National Elk Refuge, and there's a parking lot, and there's a little pond with, I think those are cattails.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just went by, and the atmosphere was really beautiful. So there's a lot of different elements: the cattails, the water, the mountains, to play around with and create something.
It's beautiful. I can't believe that you got this from a parking lot. Did you know that this vista was here? Like, did you plan to go get this image particularly? Or were you just like driving around exploring, like saw this and like pulled over and got your reference?
The thing is, about, I think 6 years ago, I took a workshop, and that was one of the locations that we painted at during the workshop. So I just decided to go back there and have a look.
Well, you got a really beautiful image, and it was really interesting to paint from. I feel like there were a lot of really interesting lessons just for me, like internally, while I was thinking through the painting on my own, but you wound up talking to me about some really interesting aspects of the composition as well. And then I know in your own piece, you wound up doing a lot to really like get the most out of this composition. So I'm super excited to dive into those little nuances and kind of hear your thoughts on them. So here is my piece. We have talked about it already, while we were working on these at the time. And I stayed overall, I would say like pretty true to the reference. Like I did like crop it down so that I knew that it would match this like 6x8 panel. So I had a sense of exactly what was going to go where, but I really didn't get creative with this in any way. I think the only real adjustment that I made was that the reference was a really blue-green throughout the entire piece. Like it just felt blue the whole way through, and I was a little bit worried that it was so cool that I wouldn't be able to manage the color successfully. And I wound up like taking it in Photoshop and using the Camera Raw filter to try and bring out some more yellows or like little pops of magenta. And it's funny because when I looked at the reference after I made that adjustment, I thought like, yeah, I'm like setting myself up for success here. But then after I saw your piece, I really wish I had just left it as is. So I'm really interested to hear kind of your thoughts, especially because I know for your own piece, you made so many strategic choices about the placement of these objects and how much you wanted to simplify them, how much you really wanted to like push that sense of perspective, whether it was, more of like a linear perspective with things like this hedge that's in the distance. I think you did a beautiful job of really creating a sense of depth, whereas mine is very straight across. But on top of that, like you really have such a beautiful way of pushing the atmospheric perspective and like creating that depth by controlling your value structure and modulating the temperature, especially for like those far off objects. What were some of the things you were thinking about as you painted your own version of this? I'd love to hear about your experience because I know we talked a little bit about mine while we were in the painting. And I wish I had been able to see what you were doing in the moment so I could ask you what you were thinking while you made yours, because your decision making was so effective on this piece, and I feel like it gives us so much that we can learn from.
How I like to do it is think about how to make the composition more engaging, but at the same time be true to the feeling of the place. And so compositionally, I was thinking, we want a few areas where we have a lot of interest, smaller shapes, and then also other areas where we have areas of rest. We have larger flat areas so that it can help lead the eye into where we want the viewer to be most engaged in. So initially there were some grass in the lower left corner, and I put them in initially, but I decided to take it out so there would be a larger area of rest with just the water. And then I compressed the middle ground and those cattails on the right so that there would be a cluster of smaller shapes in that segment of the painting. And initially I was in between having the cattails versus having some of the trees in the back being my area of focus. And I decided on the cattails because they have more small shapes and more contrast. And one more thing I was thinking about, I decided to try and break up that diagonal of the mountain by introducing a cloud that comes across the mountain.
Yeah, when I saw that, that was like the detail that made me go like, ah, darn him. He's brilliant. Why didn't I think of this? Yeah, and I imagine so much of those little decisions really come down to having so much experience with this. As I worked on this, it's the first landscape I had actually worked on in quite a while. There wasn't something like a master copy. And that was part of why I chose to paint small. I wanted something that would just feel approachable, where I couldn't necessarily get in a lot of detail or sweat that detail. But having seen your painting, I kind of wish I had gone into some of the detail that you captured with those cattails, because you do it so beautifully. And I think when we're sitting down and we're taking a look at our subject and we're getting ready to paint, it's really easy to look at something like those cattails and think it's just so overwhelming. There's a lot of noise associated with those. You could so easily get sucked into thinking you have to capture every blade of grass, or you can kind of take it to the other extreme, which is what I did, which is just to say, like, I'm just going to scrub in a general shape that hopefully evokes this object that I'm looking at.
Either approach is valid. It all depends on what kind of context you want it to be and what kind of style you're aiming for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it sort of brings me back to one of the things that was striking me as you were describing the number of things that you were thinking about in this piece. And I don't know if this is something that you've ever consciously thought about before. It's certainly not something that I consciously consider while I'm painting, but it's sometimes something that I wonder about once I'm done. Sometimes I wish I could count the number of thoughts that I'm juggling at any given point when I'm working on a piece. And I find that the longer I spend really understanding a given subject, the more certain things just become automatic. Like, I don't really think about mixing flesh tones anymore. I don't think about like what my formula is for like just my base average like white person flesh tone. Instead, I'm probably thinking about something like how I want to group together something like the hair and like really evoke that loosely. But when you're earlier in the journey, you might really have to think about every mixture you're putting down. And I think that there's really only so many things we can juggle when we're diving into a piece like that. And so I'm really curious, if you had to choose just like one of those things that you were thinking about as you dove into your painting of this subject, what do you think was like the most important thing? Was it, having a clear idea of where you wanted the focal point to be? Was it like creating depth or kind of breaking things up to create visual interest or avoid monotony? What do you think was the most important thing, or the thing that you think is most important for someone who might be newer to landscape painting, for instance?
Yeah, well, I think as we get more experience, some of the fundamentals become part of our intuition. So for someone who's newer to landscape painting, I would say first thing you got to get down is the mechanics of mixing the right colors, the right values, and then having a solid drawing. And once you're able to do that consistently is when you start worrying more about things like, how would I design this subject better to better fit the kind of story you want to tell. So for that painting, design was definitely what I was thinking about the most. Is where do I want to draw the most attention? And then are there any secondary areas of interest? How far back do I want that mountain to feel? That kind of stuff.
Yeah. I imagine a lot of things like being able to push the mountain back comes from having a certain amount of experience in person, because cameras so often like really bring the background forward and give you the sense of the mountain being, 100 yards away from you, regardless of what you're looking at. But one thing I've noticed from doing this a couple times with you before, I remember we were doing like a painting live stream together ages ago on Facebook, and we were painting the same thing, and I would wait for the camera to switch to your painting, and I would use that as a clue to like help me figure out what I wanted to be doing differently in this piece, and like really pushing that sense of atmosphere and like lightening up the value and cooling off the mountain that was in the background was one of the things that like really, really struck me. And I try and think about that every time that I sit down to paint a landscape after having done that with you. But I was really surprised at just how consistently you aren't painting what's literally there on the reference. You're painting based off of your experience, having painted a lot of these things in person and understanding how to really exaggerate what you're seeing to make it actually feel more lifelike.
Yeah, because the goal is never to paint something like the photograph, right? The reference is a starting point, and as artists, we aren't recreating something, we are creating. So references, and or even when we're out plein air painting itself, those things are only the starting point. And so if there's a way to create the feeling of that place and that at that moment and your emotional response to it, but do it in a way that might be more beautifully designed than what you're presented with out there. I think that's the goal.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of that juggling of like thinking about how to move things around to make sure that your eye moves through the image nicely, understanding how the camera distorts things and what it actually looked like in person, and being able to like really capture that experience of being there in the moment. So almost staying more faithful to what your eye saw or what experience has shown you will capture the feeling of being there in that space, and sort of juxtaposing that off of being really thoughtful about the design and not being afraid to make adjustments to the composition when necessary. So, with that in mind, I'm really curious, but also kind of dreading asking you about what I've done here. So, after I saw yours, my immediate response was, oh, I could have pushed this atmosphere so much more. My other immediate response was, I didn't need to be afraid of how cool and like gray and almost blue the reference felt. I could have kept that and have it work really well. I think some of the other things, I definitely looked at what you did and I thought about like, oh, could I have improved the shape of the mountain another way? Or would it have made more sense for me to like delete some information in the foreground or create a more beautiful arrangement of a variety of shapes in this kind of row of hedges that's like up against the foot of this mountain. But I feel like the two really big things were actually more about like pushing this atmosphere and really about the color choices. But I'm really curious like what your impressions are. If I were to go back into this painting, or if I were to paint something like this again, what would you say would be like the most important or the most helpful thing for me to think about based on what I have here?
Let's see. So, I do think that your color harmony works as well, and just because that I did things one way or someone else did things their way, that's their interpretation of it, and you don't necessarily have to feel like there's only one right answer. So for this one, I would say maybe the middle ground can cool that off a little bit, and then try and get it to lay down flat.
Yeah, and that's more of a drawing thing, right? Like just making sure that this looks like it exists in space correctly, or when you think about something laying down flat, is it a different adjustment?
So that's tricky. Sometimes you can do it with some subtle color temperature shifts, like making when it gets further, shifting it slightly cooler.
Yeah.
But also a drawing thing, you want the perspective to feel consistent, because from the cattails, it kind of looks like you're looking at it from a lower angle. And so if you're looking at it from a low angle and you have such a thick section of grass, then the only way for that to make sense is if that grass were on a hill.
Yeah, no, I and it's funny because as soon as you said that, I could kind of see the distortion, but that makes a lot of sense. Like, especially this mark right here, like just how yellow it gets so close to the horizon. And you can see the same thing over here. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that really was doing the painting a disservice.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I was concerned about, because In the reference, it was actually like how you painted it. And so, because the cattails with all the small shapes, then you would have to make sure that reads as you're further above. And so your options are to, if you paint it from a lower angle, you gotta compress your shapes in the distance for the perspective to read correctly, or you have to, if you imagine those cattails, like forget they're cattails, but just think of it as a geometric shape. You gotta find a way to show more of the top plane in order for it to read as if you're coming from a higher angle. And so if you do that, then it would make sense for that middle ground to be thicker. And so it becomes a matter of the design. What makes more sense? Do we want to compress everything, or do we want to leave it as is? And so I decided to compress everything because that's gonna bunch more small shapes all together in a smaller area, and I felt like that would make things more engaging to have more contrast between small shapes and big shapes.
I am so glad that you spoke to that, Kyle. This reminds me of something that actually comes up all the time when I talk to the artists that I mentor and teach, and that is particularly in portraiture. That there are some things that, in my experience, you just have to learn by like falling into the trap a certain amount of times, and like trusting what you see doesn't always work. I think like a good example of that is, if you're looking at a model and the model has like really hard lines on their face, it's always going to be important to start from those kinds of things staying a little bit softer, or else you're going to like really artificially age the model. And like in theory, that almost shouldn't happen. You should be able to feel like you can really copy what you're seeing. But in practice, you just wind up sort of learning the hard way through repetition that you need to kind of make these adjustments. I think another really good example there is something like the way that the upper lip is rendered. If the edge where the upper lip meets the regular skin feels too hard, it's going to make your subject look like they're wearing lip liner. Even if it feels like a really, really powerful, stark change, and there's a hard edge there, we have to like really make sure that we are sort of almost overcompensating to keep it really soft. And I think that's one of those things that you just get from sitting with a subject for a really long time and having mentors who can kind of help give you permission and say, like, I know the photo has this problem in it. You're going to want to overcome this on your own through problem solving, through painting a little bit differently than the reference shows you, versus just trusting that if you paint it exactly like the reference, it's going to work and be beautiful.
Yeah, and I was just at an open studio session before this conversation, and so I was painting this portrait, but how I like to think about it is there's a hierarchy of importance to everything. So, and I think in portraiture, or really in paintings in general, it's first is the big forms. So you want to make sure you have the volume of the head first, and then gradually the smaller forms. So the eye socket and the nose, and then it's the small forms and the details. So that's where those lines, the details in the eyes, or subtle changes. Let's say like where the nasal bone ends, or where there's a little plane change there, or where you see the different muscles in the head. So those things are important too, but they have to come last, and they have to sit on top of the forms that you already established. Otherwise, you get a really bumpy looking portrait.
Yeah. So to kind of like apply this back to landscape painting, it almost seems like you would have to approach this somewhat conceptually. Like you're not just looking at optically what is the reference showing you, you're also thinking about what is happening with the perspective. Like when I look at this landscape going back into space, am I really capturing the fact that this is a plane that's facing up in the sky and it's going back into space? Am I showing that it's going back into space? Am I really capturing that this isn't a whole bunch of individual cattails, but I can think of it as like a cube, for instance, that's just been like compressed one way or the other? Am I thinking about the fact, like, am I thinking about how much space is between here and here, between the cattails and the mountain? It seems like in order to kind of create that same sense of hierarchy or troubleshooting in something like landscape painting, you really have to be able to think of it somewhat conceptually in order to really understand those big shapes and not just copy and be prone to falling into like traps that references can create for you, like I did on this one.
Well, I think sometimes we're told always paint what you see, but there's always some component of optical and conceptual thinking when we're painting, even if we're just thinking about what's in the light, what's in the shadow, right? That's the conceptual idea. So for me, I think I know that my eyes are not perfect and my brain is not perfect either. So I have to find a way for them to work together to get a little closer to perfect.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful note to kind of sum up this experience on. And I feel like one of my really big takeaways from painting this with you and like hearing your thoughts and seeing what you did differently is just that in the end, bridging all of those gaps to like get that much closer to perfection. It's not always about having like the secret for any given painting. It's not about being able to go into a painting thinking about all the things that you were thinking about. It'd be great if we could all be thinking at that level for every painting we ever sit down to make. But in order to get there, we have to really give ourselves the space to explore a subject and experiment with it a lot and like find out what the common pitfalls are with those subjects. And then over time, we can really work our way to that elevated understanding that you're really speaking to.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Thanks, Kyle. Awesome. Well, for anyone who really loves your rendition of this painting, is this available for sale? Where can people find this?
It is. It's currently available through me. So you follow me on Instagram, send me a message, or you can send me an email, kylekcma@hotmail.com.
Awesome. Perfect. And I will add your Instagram down in the description so people can find you there. I imagine DMing you on Instagram is also a way that people can get in touch if they see a painting from you that they love.
Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Kyle, thank you for sitting down with me and chatting with me today. I know when we sat down, we weren't sure how long we would be talking about this, but like knowing you and me, I'm not surprised that we spent nearly like an hour sitting down just to like geek out about all of this. So thank you for taking the time. And I know, it's a pleasure to like bring you onto the channel and let people hear more about the way that you work and the way that you think about solving these problems. Because I know I always feel just like really humbled and honored to be able to have that time with you personally.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me. I've watched your channel for a long time and always enjoy seeing your content. I think you have a lot of great advice out there that are really helpful. So it really is an honor to be part of it.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you. All right. Until you and I chat again, happy painting. I hope you enjoyed this conversation between me and Kyle. If you are interested in picking up Kyle's painting for yourself, I have a link down to his Instagram and his website below, and you're welcome to reach out to him via Instagram DM if you would like to take this painting home or inquire about any others. All right, until next time, happy painting.